Hello, this unit is going to be on Chapter 22 for Miller and Levine, or just in general, the solid waste and recycling notes for the AP exam. Some of the things that you're going to consider are the chapter overview questions that you see before you. Other things that you want to consider for studying for this unit are going to be the landfill design. You need to know how the structure of a landfill works. Categories of solid waste. We're going to look at options to get for disposal for different types of waste, such as solid municipal waste, as well as hazardous waste. Other things that we're going to consider are going to be byproducts of landfills. You need to be familiar with a couple of laws, such as RCRA and CERCLA, the largest contribution to waste, and the best ways to solve these problems. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Here's one of the second pages of the chapter overview questions, and here we go. The first case study that we're going to talk about that you need to know for the AP exam is the course case study, the Love Canal, which was in New York. And this is entitled, There Is No Away. President Jimmy Carter declared this area a disaster site and people were forced to evacuate in 1980. Well, let's go back to the beginning of the Love Canal. Between 1842 and 1953, Hooker Chemicals, multiple chemical wastes, they dumped it into these drums. You may seen some types of drums before, but they were steel drums. They were sealed and they were buried with a clay cap covered it. They were dumped into a canal, an excavation site, and they called this Love Canal. In 1953, they sold this area or this land to the Niagara Falls School District for $1. In that statement or in that sale, the company inserted a disclaimer, which means that they were not responsible for any type of liability for the wastes. However, in 1957, Hooker Chemicals, kind of get back to here really quick, Hooker Chemicals warned the school district not to disrupt that area because it could start to break away the seals of the clay. Therefore, the leachate or the waste it was going to come up into the soil and could cause some damage. But in 1959, an elementary school was playing in the fields and homes were built on this area, and it disrupted the land. And many people, including children, they complained of chemical smells, and some got some chemical burns from the site. And this was then in 1976. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter declared it a federal disaster area. It's still controversy to how many people were burned or got diseases from this site. However, it did start what was called a Superfund law, and this is where those companies or the polluters, the people who did the polluting, have to pay for that cleanup for the toxic site. And this is something that was over for the whole United States. With regards to Superfund, in the United States alone, there's over 1,000 Superfund sites. And again, this is an area that has been polluted or abandoned. It could be an abandoned supermarket area that nobody uses anymore. So anything that has toxic sites or whatnot is considered to be a Superfund act. So now we're going to go ahead and look at the different types of solid waste, such as the difference between solid waste as well as toxic and hazardous waste. The first thing on our agenda is that we need to define the different types or categories of solid waste. So the first thing we're going to talk about right now is the definition of solid waste. That's any discarded material that is not a liquid or a gas. When we look at industrial solid waste, you have anything that is from an industry, such as supply people with goods and services, so any type of business. However, when you have your municipal solid waste, that's going to be produced directly from your homes as well as schools and hospitals. So keep that in mind as well. The second one is going to be hazardous waste, and this is what type of waste that's going to be threatening human health or poisonous, reactive, corrosive, or flammable, and that also includes your radioactive waste. In the United States alone, it has 4.6 of the world's population, but produces about 1/3 of the world's solid waste. The United States leads the world in trash production per person. So again, we are considered to be a throwaway society. Some garbologists, people who study garbage or going from cradle to the grave, look, again, I've kind of spoken about that in class. They look at how our landfill waste break down over time and report and indicate items such as newspapers that can last for 50 years or more without breaking down. Other garbologists have electronically tagged thousands of different types of items to see where they end up. For example, your diaper going from a toddler, it takes about 25 to 50 years to break down a diaper, and some are not able to break down at all. So here you can see an individual in Jakarta, Indonesia, that is polluted, and he's looking for some items to salvage or sell. About 98% of in the United States is going to be your industrial solid waste. The remaining 1.5 is going to be your MSW. And again, that's your municipal solid waste. They can be dumped into landfills. 30% is going to be recycled, and 15% is going to be burned in incinerators, whereas about 55% is going to be going again into landfills. So how do we reduce that? One method to reduce this waste and pollution is to implement a waste management system. The high waste approach accepts waste production as a result of economic growth. When we look at Alabama, for example, we need to start reducing our trash because the landfill that is in Huntsville, if we keep doing what we're doing, we only have about 20 years left of that, and that's in your lifetime. And that what's going to happen is we're going to have to outsource, meaning going to a different county, which is going to mean higher prices for garbage being collected here in Madison City. So let's look at some other type of wastes. We have your e-waste. This is something that's new and up and coming. We also see that this is what's called planned obsolescence. If you notice you have an iPhone 4 or maybe you have an iPhone 5 or a 6, because they always make upgrades to where you need the newest thing so that you have to go and buy it. Or look at the iPhone 4. They purposely created that iPhone 4 with a glass on both the front and the back, knowing that people would drop it and break it, going to have to get either a new phone or getting it fixed. So they do this on purpose. When you look at e-waste, we look at toxic and hazardous waste such as PVC, lead, mercury, and cadmium. And the United States, almost about half the world e-waste, but we only recycle about 10% of it. We actually outsource it to China. And there was a 2020 video on ABC, I believe it was, and looking at some companies that were doing certain e-waste that was illegally sending over to China, because there's certain components of that e-waste that you were not supposed to send over. So where do we put this MSW? We put them in landfills in the United States. Let me get to that slide. Solid waste is placed in a hole and it's going to be covered, and we're going to look at that structure in a minute. So I'm going to go very quickly on this one. The current criteria is that landfills cannot pollute the surface or the groundwater, and it has to be capped. It has to have clay in order to decrease the amount of leachate, which is going to be the nasty water or the polluted water that seeps through. Oil is not allowed. Neither are paints, tires, antifreeze, air conditioning coolants, lead or car batteries. Those cannot be sent into the landfill. We'll look at compost. This is just your dark brown humus-like material that's rich in soil and nutrients. We have benefits to that it aerates the soil. It helps prevent erosion, and it prevents nutrients from being dumped into landfills. So you can have a compost at your house. It's very good for your soil as well as for your plants. And this is how you can make your own compost. We have our recycling. That's your conservation of resources. The biggest thing that you want to do with recycling is we have our 3 R's, or actually your 4 for the exam, but you want to start refusing, and that is not buying those items that cannot be recycled. Then you can be reducing the amount that you use. You can reuse it and then recycle it in different ways. One thing that you can, the general purpose of recycling, it saves land, it reduces the amount of solid waste. One of the largest types of recycling is going to be your aluminum cans because you get the most money for it. You can recycle aluminum cans to go back and become recycled cans again, or excuse me, aluminum cans again, and that is called closed loop recycling. Other examples can be gold, lead, nickel, aluminum. These are all recyclables. The problem, though, is that people always think recycling is free, that there's no cost. However, it is expensive because you have the energy, you need the energy, the inputs to generate, um, to recycle those. Look at the recycling plant here in Huntsville, and those plants also generate a little bit of pollution. When you look at the de-inking process in your recycling, that is produces a toxic sludge. However, you have the benefits that are going to outweigh the negatives. It conserves our natural resources. When you look at the Sunday edition of New York Times, by recycling those, that consumes 62,000 trees by itself. So here's some specific recycled items. You can recycle glass. Again, you can recycle aluminum. Paper. Paper is the largest by weight of how much is consumed and what is thrown away by the United States. Some recyclable plastics that you want to be familiar with, they do have numbers on the bottom. Your PET, your polyethylene type of plastics, these are used to make your soft drink bottles. And number one on the top, these are bags, carpet fibers, ropes, and pillows that can be recycled to do that. And even the ones, some of them can be recycled, for example, at Home Depot to be the paint buckets. You have number two, and these are found in milk and your milk jugs and detergents, and they can be recycled into flower pots and trash cans. You have PVC number three, and this is used in your shampoo bottles and cooking oil bottles, fast food service items. You have number four in grocery bags and shrink wrap. And you have number five, it's used in yogurt containers. And then you have number six, it's found in disposable hot cups or packing materials such as peanuts. And you have your other, and that's just a mixture of different plastics. So how do we deal with these types of waste? What we have is called the Integrated Waste Management System. The definition of it is the most effective way to deal with your solid and hazardous wastes. And these includes your 3 R's. Again, it's your reducing, reusing, recycling. But I'm going to add a fourth one, and that goes before reducing, and that's refusing that item. So when we look at our first priority, you're trying to refuse the item or reduce it from environmental harm, and that transfers the waste from one part of the environment to the other. So again, you're trying to use less of that harmful product, or in all, you can just refuse it and not use it. The second priority is to reuse those products. Recycling, again, you have open loop and you have closed loop. Closed loop is going to be where you're using that type of material to recycle it to make the same type. For example, your aluminum cans. That's closed loop. Versus open loop is you're taking, let's say, a certain plastic and you're making a t-shirt out of it. And that's going to be your open loop. So you're taking that product and you're recycling it to a small fiber and making a different product. The last priority is the waste management system, and you're trying to treat that waste to reduce its toxicity, whether it be incinerating, which is going to be burning. We see that here in Huntsville where we have the steam plant for energy. You can bury the waste in landfills, or you can release the waste into an environment or disperse it and by diluting it. So here are some ways, or what are some things that you can do. You want to pick some of the things that you can remember for the AP exam. Refusing it or reusing it. Recycling, and then here's your primary and your secondary. One of the ways to treat our waste is to burn it and then burying the solid waste component of it. Here what you see is the burning the solid waste. This is an incinerator. This is the waste to energy incinerator with pollution controls that burns the mixed solid waste. When we look globally, the MSW that is burned over 1,000 large waste to energy incinerators, which boil water and make steam for heating water or space for production or even for electricity. We see that here in Huntsville because there is a steam plant and that supplies electricity to part of the arsenal. Japan and a few European countries incinerate most of their MSW. The advantages and disadvantages of burning solid waste are given in your textbook um, in, in chapter 22. You have high operating costs, you have air pollution concerns, and you have some citizens that are opposed to this process. However, the benefits are the volume of the waste is reduced by 90%, and the heat produced produces steam, which can warm buildings or generate electricity. In 1999, the United States had about 110 waste to incinerators, which burned 16% of the nation's solid waste, and it decreased the amount of CO2 emissions that the power plants that run the fossil fuels. Giant piles of tires are also being burned to supply electricity. So these are some of the benefits. The next thing that you need to know for the AP exam is going to be the anatomy of a landfill. And I'm going to go over more specifically in a moment with a different picture. But here you see a landfill where you have the solid waste here. And then you're going to have some components here that you need to be familiar with, as well as up here on top. But most solid waste is buried in landfills in the United States. Sometimes they can leak toxic liquids into the soil and water, and this is called leachate. Your sanitary landfills spread the solid waste out in thin layers, and we see that in Huntsville, and that's to reduce that leachate. But in open dumps, where we see in China and Japan and certain other areas where just the garbage is out there, you have the pollution, you have the methane that is produced. Those are high pollutants. So again, your open dumps in the ground hold garbage, and you may just have a little bit of dirt, but you're gonna have a lot of pollution. Your sanitary landfills, which we have in the United States, they spread the solid waste out in thin layers, which is going to be mandatory here. And they have different types of layers, and you have clay and plastic, and this is to reduce the leachate. The modern landfills, they line the bottom with impermeable liner, which collects the leachate. You have rainwater is contaminated as it percolates through down in here, and it through the solid waste. So as it percolates through, it's going to get contaminated. That leachate is collected and stored in tanks. So as you can see here, it goes in here and it's pumped up, and then it's sent to a sewage treatment plant where that water is going to be treated, as you can see in this picture over here. And we'll talk about the treatment plant in a later chapter. So here again is a more specific detail of a typical anatomy of a landfill. I've put this into our Dropbox so you can have a picture of this for yourself. But you want to be familiar with the different layers. So this is a cross section of a typical landfill, where here you have your covering vegetation. A lot of times they would put vegetation or grass or different types of flowers over that, or it can just be flat. You have your topsoil, and then you're going to have your protective cover covering your soil. Then you have your drainage layer, and this is going to be a layer of sand or gravel and that thick plastic, and this is to protect the cover soil, enhance the stability of the landfill, and prevent the infiltration of water from the cap. You have usually a geotextile fabric, and that might be very similar to some type of felt that you might have at the store. Then the next one is you have a geomembrane, which is at number 5 right here. And this is going to be placed over the waste, where you have your waste here and waste here. And that is to form a cap, and that in order for the landfill to reach the permitted height. And this layer prevents the excess precipitation from entering the landfill. You have your daily cover, and this is going to be for each working period. So for example, at the Huntsville site, every day what they do is they have your layer of trash, and then they're going to have the daily cover, and they cover it, and you can only have so many levels to where you have to cap off the landfill. So after each day, you go and you have your cap over here, and then you have another layer, and then you have that daily cover until you're going to be completely capped with the landfill, and then where you'll have these layers, and you won't even know that there's a landfill there. You can go and visit the landfill over in the Huntsville area. I'll see if we can take a trip over there. So again, number 8 is your waste. And then when you have over here your 9, this is going to be your leachate collection layer. So again, like I said in the previous slide, when it rains, it's going to percolate down, and it's going to go through that trash and that waste, and it's going to be polluted. So here we have this layer, and that's going to be an area of thick plastic and mesh, and it's going to collect that leachate and then drain it to these pipes to where it can go to the water sanitation and treatment plant for it to be reused. Number 11 is going to be your leachate collection pipe system. So again, this is the pipe system. And then number 12 is your geomembrane. This is a thick layer, a liner that prevents the leachate from leaving that landfill and entering the environment because they're trying to trap it into these into the pipe system. Then you have your number 13, which is going to be your compacted clay, and that's located directly below the geomembrane in order to, again, prevent it from going into the environment. And then you have your prepared number 14. It's really not to scale, but it's a native soil beneath the landfill. They're prepared as needed prior to beginning of the landfill. So you want to be very familiar with how the anatomy of a landfill is for the exam. The third thing that we're going to be talking about in this unit is going to be hazardous waste, and this is, again, something that you need to be familiar with for the AP exam. We're going to talk about different types of toxic materials a little bit later, more specifically, but for now you want to know about the classes of hazardous waste, such as organic compounds, such as pesticides and PCBs and dioxins, and then you have your toxic heavy metals, such as lead and mercury. So how do we deal with hazardous waste? There's 3 levels of priority for dealing with hazardous waste. It is produce less, convert to less hazardous substance, and the third, to put the rest in long-term safe storage. When we look at a case study, more than 70% of the world's e-waste ends up in China. Over 30,000 workers toil in unsafe conditions and are exposed to toxins. Some computers companies now offering recycling, though only 18% of the e-waste in the U.S. is recycled, 80% of which is shipped overseas. We're going to look at how they get rid of those toxicity of the hazardous wastes. There's different types of treatment. The first one is bioremediation, that's using bacteria. Then you have phytoremediation, and then you have burying as well. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the different types of regulation. The 2 federal laws that you must know for the AP exam as well as mine. It's the disposal of the hazardous waste in the United States. The first one is going to be your Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or a lot of students just call it RCRA. This regulates about 5% of the United States hazardous waste. And the second one is you have the Comprehensive Environment Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This is called CERCLA, or your Superfund program. And this was passed in 1980. And this was a response from the Love Canal. This law identifies sites go on national priority lists and are scheduled for total cleanup. There are also laws that provide for cleaning up Brownsfields. A Brownsfield is just another, not a super fun, but a Brownsfield is going to be an abandoned site with contaminants or with hazardous waste like factories, gas stations, and junkyards. Your Resource Recovery Act, or RCRA, is going to be your cradle to the grave, and this is where you keep track of your waste. For example, if you have a phone, how was it built? You have your inputs of energy as well as products and pollution in the making of the iPhone. Then you have to package the iPhone. Then you have to get it to the stores and then get it to you. And then how is it disposed of? So that's called cradle to the grave. So let's look at how do we get these hazardous materials to be less hazardous substance. The first one is going to be called biological methods. The first one is your bioremediation. This is using bacteria or enzymes, and those are going to help destroy the toxic and hazardous waste or convert them into more benign substances. The second one is going to be phytoremediation, and this is using a natural or genetically modified plant to absorb and filter and remove those contaminants from the polluted soil and water. So as you can see here, we do have a factory, we have our polluted groundwater, and we have some plants here, so this might be your phytoremediation, but in the groundwater we may have some bioremediation going on in order to, again, take those hazardous materials out of the water and as well as the soil. We may have to incinerate, and heating another type that's not going to be your biological, but they can break them down because they only last at a certain temperature, and it can break them down and convert them to less harmful. And then you have your long-term storage, such as in Love Canal that didn't work. We even have these on the arsenal. is that hazardous waste can be disposed of by deep well disposal. Liquid hazardous wastes are pumped under pressure into dry, porous rock far beneath the surface. And you also have impoundments where you have depressions such as ponds or pits or lagoons into which liners are placed and liquid hazardous wastes are stored. You also have long-term storage, and these are where toxic materials cannot be detoxified or destroyed. So you have these metal drums, and they're used for storage, and usually in some type of pit. And they're secure landfills, and then they're buried very carefully. We do have these on the arsenal, and this is what that secure landfill looks like. In the United States, there are only 23 commercial hazard waste landfills, and I believe one of them is on the arsenal. So you have that. It's secure. To wrap up everything is how can we make a connection or how can we make a transition to a low waste society since we are considered to be a high waste society? What's the outlook on it? Individuals can have different types of treatment and storage facilities. You have environmental justice means that every person is entitled to protection from the environmental hazards, so you have that right. The Basel Convention is an international treaty banning developed countries from shipping hazardous waste to other countries without their permission. And that's what I was talking about before. There was a special 2020, there were certain companies that were secretly taped because they were sending some pollutants over to China without permission. In 2000, a global treaty to control 12 persistent organic pollutants called POPs. These are also called the Dirty Dozen. However, there are more than 12 now, but they still refer them to the Dirty Dozen. And that was developed to make effective. 50 countries must ratify the treaty. POPs are toxic chemicals stored in the fatty tissues of humans and other organisms. And to this day, I believe that you have a certain amount that is detectable levels in your blood. Polluters and producers should pay for the waste that they produce, and we should mimic nature by reusing and recycling the materials that we use. So to wrap up for this unit is the biggest things or the takeaways that you want to know is that you want to first refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. You want to understand and describe the landfill design. You want to be able to categorize the solid wastes. You want to be able to identify the types of hazardous waste and know how or know what the disposal options are. Make sure you understand the two laws, CERCLA and RCRA, as well as the Superfund and Love Canal case study. You want to know the byproducts of landfills. Those are the leachate as well as methane. You want to know the stream of the largest contributor of waste, which is paper, and that's by weight, and that's what it will be on the AP exam. And what goes where, so we talked about 55% goes to the landfill, about 30% goes to recycling, and 15% is incinerated. And then talking about incineration is that's going to decrease the percent that goes into the landfill because it's burned and usually for some type of energy. And the last thing that you want to make sure, and you can even look up to see something that you have, is planned obsolescence. And again, that is a term that's used for when companies, they know that they are providing a product that is only temporary because they want you to go and buy the next thing very quickly. They don't want you to have a phone that's going to be that you will use for 20 years. They only want you to use it for about 1 to 2 so that you can have a new one. So on that end, make sure that you reduce, reuse, and recycle. Have a great day.